Welcome to Into the Abyss podcast. My name is Todd Decker, and today I'm here with Taylor. Taylor, welcome on.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, very happy to have you on. So I love with this podcast I bring on friends and people who I think are interesting to talk to, and I've been thinking for a while, I should definitely get Taylor on because every time we get together and have conversations, I just feel like, wow, that was really interesting, and I feel like I learned a lot and just feel stimulated in many ways from the things that I get from you. So anyway, happy to have you on. I've been wanting to do this for a while.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I think we talked a little bit about stuff, some subjects to talk about, and I'll kind of let you take that off. Do you want to introduce the stuff that you've been thinking about and wanting to talk about?
Yeah. So, like I said earlier, I've got kind of this like jumble of thoughts, so it may be somewhat disorganized, but if you have questions, just ask.
Sounds good.
So what I know you originally asked me to talk about Jung, and I studied Jung in college, and it was interesting because when you brought him up, I started thinking about how he relates to the things that I'm interested in and learning about right now. With the Black Lives Matter movement happening recently, or at least being more popular recently, I've been doing a lot of study in race and race identity, and also because I became a doula a couple of years ago, those sort of came together, I guess, in lots of different ways. So I think probably first it would be good to like talk about Jung and like what his basic ideas are. There's lots of different parts of Jungian theory. And that's why it's kind of like a great framework for looking at things through it, because once you understand the basic tenets of like Jungian theory, everything can be reinterpreted that way.
Sounds fascinating.
Through kind of a psychological lens, I guess. So Jung, and I think probably most relevant to like the stuff I've been learning lately and my current pregnancy, have been things having to do with the collective unconscious. And Jung kind of came up with the collective unconscious, with the idea of the collective unconscious from studying folklore around the world and noticing these patterns or motifs that were happening in cultures across the world independently of one another. So cultures that had never had any interaction with each other all had some form of the Cinderella story, for example. Mm-hmm. I think that was one that he came across that was really popular.
Yeah.
And it just kind of cropped up everywhere, and he kind of came up with this theory that like people might be born with these ideas already embedded in their subconscious, that were universal to the human experience, and call them archetypes.
Right. Okay.
So, so that's kind of the general idea. And I think it was revolutionary at the time. It was like his contribution to psychology, whereas Freud kind of contributed the idea of the subconscious to begin with. Jung's contribution was more like the idea of the collective unconscious. And what's interesting is more recently we've been having like some science come out that somewhat more substantiates this idea of the collective unconscious. And I kind of wanted to talk about it in relation to pregnancy, intergenerational trauma, and just a bunch of different things, I guess.
Sounds good. Yeah.
So, so I'm trying to think of where I want to start.
Well, could I ask you? So your studies were in literature, right?
Yes, yeah. So I was an English major, and I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a doctor. And mainly I only think about these things in terms of like how to understand myself. And so if I'm like misrepresenting some of these ideas, forgive me, because I'm not an expert. I like to kind of connect these different things and see how they connect to my life, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So has it, in your studies, I imagine, was that applying Jungian ideas to literature, and now later it's kind of moved to your own your own life?
Yeah, exactly. My senior class, or my senior thesis class, was all about actually watching popular movies like Inception and The Matrix, and
Interesting.
I'm trying to think of what else. Da Vinci Code, all through a Jungian lens, and then taking what we learned, because those are movies that are like, obviously they have lots of symbolism in them, and then taking what we learned about symbolism and Jungian analysis and applying it to classical literature, as well as whatever literature we were reading in our other classes. Mm-hmm. So that was really cool. And it also involved a little bit of gender studies and, just feminist studies. And it related a lot to LDS culture, because I was at BYU. So
right. Okay. Yeah.
Of course, we talked about religion and Jung. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it was a pretty cool class, and I feel like it kind of changed a lot of things for me, because I had this like framework for like looking at things.
I think I've told you this joke before, but I like it. And since you mentioned BYU, I heard a talk by Carolyn Pearson once, who's an LDS poet, and she was talking about Carl Jung, and it was to a LDS audience, and when she mentioned Carl Jung, she was saying, "Oh, he's Brigham's younger brother who didn't come west." I just thought I got a kick out of that. So,
that's funny, because I feel like he was kind of. There are definitely some ideas he has that I think conflict with Mormon ideology.
Oh, okay.
Especially when it comes to sexuality and gender, but yeah, anyways, we can talk about that.
Yeah, definitely. I want to get into that. Yeah, because that's interesting.
So, I mean, just sort of as a side note, he, some people think that he could have been bisexual.
Oh, okay.
Just because he had some ideas about homosexuality that were like, essentially he saw it as like a normal part of the progression of the individuation of the self. So,
okay.
And it was kind of progressive for his time. I think probably nowadays we would look back at that and think that it's a little bit homophobic, the way that he approaches homosexuality, but he does kind of, basically his ideas were that it was normal for homosexuality to be a part of everyone's development, especially in adolescence, and that eventually the goal was to grow out of that and to find a partner of the opposite sex. And that was like a sign of having individuated or having developed to maturity.
Now, individuating, what is that term? What is that process?
Yeah,
mean?
So individuation is, I guess I define it as the development of the self. Okay. So separating yourself, getting to know yourself in a way that you're able to define yourself as different from other people, but also it has a lot to do with like maturity and development psychologically. Mm-hmm. The self being like another word for the soul, or the subconscious, and finding balance in the subconscious, so that you're not dealing with any sort of complexes, which are like conflicts between the conscious and the unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
So you get to a place where, or it's the process of becoming, but it's also the process of getting to a place where you find balance between the conscious and the unconscious, and balance between lots of different types of opposites, like the anima and the animus, and good and evil, and the ego and the shadow, and all those things.
Right. And I remember you mentioned the anima and the animus, and I looked it up briefly, what that is. So are those processes
they're
of male and
archetypes.
female, or? Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
Can you talk
so
about those a little?
Yeah, so they're sort of like the male and female archetypes, and they can be associated with all of the classic gender stereotypes.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But they're also sort of more intangible than that, as archetypes tend to be. The meaning that we give them depends on who's talking about them and what culture they're in and what context they're being used in. So, I guess that's kind of the idea, is that they represent male and female, but they're not prescriptive of what male and female have to look like.
My daughter just brought me a drawing.
Oh, cute.
Sometimes we keep it real. When is this your art, sweetie?
Yeah.
Oh, all right.
So cute.
So, and which one is which for the anima and animus? Which one is the male and female?
Anima is male and animus is female.
Okay, and yes. I was wondering, so I could see how stereotypes would kind of work into that. I was kind of thinking about that as like, okay, yeah, I could see that, but I mean, maybe that's not necessarily a problem, or they're kind of.
I think I've heard him explain it, or I've read him explain it in a couple of different ways. One of them being that, like, a male person would have an animus subconscious that would sort of balance out the consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
Male consciousness.
So that would be a male having.
You are would be, your unconscious would be the opposite, sort of balancing you out.
Oh, okay, interesting.
So in a way, everyone has both, and it is both, and so it's sort of like this tension of balancing these opposites together so that you can become a whole person. So also the anima and the animus can be seen as archetypes of romantic love, that you're, I guess, part of the individuation process for Jung might have been to realize your opposite in real life.
Yeah.
So your partner might end up, or the people that you're drawn to might end up representing some of those opposites that are in your subconscious, that are opposite of your ego or your consciousness.
Okay. Yeah.
So
yeah, and I could see, like, does he talk about whether that's resisted, like, or difficult? It's like, so I'm thinking like a man trying to come to terms with his feminine animus.
Oh yeah.
If that's okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking along the right lines. Then okay, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you are too one-sided, then you will develop a complex, basically.
Ah, okay, okay.
And
what would that complex be like in that case?
It depends on the person, probably.
Yeah.
And any Jungian psychologist would just, probably be evaluating their patient based on how balanced they think they are, and I don't know.
Yeah. Well, have you read much Ernest Hemingway?
A little, yeah.
So I just think of him a little bit because he's sexuality in his writings very interesting. Like, because he's kind of like the manly man, right? And but then like impotence is like a common theme in his work. I don't know. It almost seems like there's some type of struggle going on there. So
Definitely. Yeah. See, like as soon as you learn these like basic concepts, you start to see all these examples in literature and real life of like, oh, that's,
yeah,
that's where I see that symbol in that literature. Yeah.
it seems like a great way to, I guess, connect ideas, like cast a net over everything and kind of organize it all.
For sure. Absolutely. So lately, like my subject of study has been, race identity and also mostly my own individuation and my own race identity. I am probably what you'd call undetectably Hispanic. I look white, I sound white, and I identify as white, but my grandma immigrated from Puerto Rico to New York when she was little. My great grandma had, my grandma says it was 9 kids, but my mom says it was 11 kids, and I haven't met them all, so I couldn't tell you. Mm-hmm. And she was escaping a domestic violence situation from her husband in Puerto Rico, and came to America to sort of get away from him. And that happened to be during a period of time when the U.S. was offering offering vaccines to Puerto Rican women, which effectually sterilized them without consent. Wow. And I don't know for sure that actually happened to my great grandma, but it would make sense, especially with her coming over with all these kids, because, she didn't have birth control at that time. And it was like, mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
and she didn't have any children after that?
She didn't have any children after that.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm kind of running on that assumption. It's something unspoken in my family, but something that is probably happened. Mm-hmm. And then, she came to work at a factory as a seamstress. I think my grandma said she was making like $4 a week or something like that. Some ridiculously small amount of money, sounding now that even with inflation still would have been very, very small.
Yeah.
And my grandma says that they lived in this little apartment that is now where like the projects are. And she says that they all shared one toilet and that the walls would sweat because of just like the amount of bodies in a small space.
Oh, yeah.
Because they were all sleeping in one big room together, and they were extremely poor. Mm-hmm. And my grandma says that they would eat rice and beans every night because that was all they could afford. Mm-hmm. So, and my grandma, she just wanted nothing more than to get out of there and to get married as soon as possible so that she could leave. So my grandma married an Italian man. And it's funny because my grandma's name is Maria. And she married this Italian man in New York that I guess like the Puerto Ricans and the Italians didn't like each other a ton. And so it was basically West Side Story.
Yeah, I was thinking, was his name Tony? Yeah, it sounds...
Yeah, I actually don't remember his name, but she married him and lived out West Side Story, I guess. Okay. And then eventually divorced him and remarried. I think actually ultimately she may have had 3 marriages. Mm-hmm. And then ended up with my grandpa now. Yeah. Yeah. And I think she had my mom with her second marriage. And so my mom also has a similar sort of adoption story to me. Mm-hmm. where, because my mom had me with some guy
Mm-hmm.
and I was adopted by my dad. And so this sort of origin story for me has become more important than probably it would be for most other people, just because
Sure.
I don't have like half of my family history.
Yeah.
There's my dad, and obviously I'm sort of adopted into your family, which is
Mm-hmm.
why you're my cousin.
Right.
But my dad, or at least my biological father, I've never met him. I don't know of any of his medical history or his family history. So other than like, I know he's white.
Yeah.
Probably some kind of European white. So my matrilineal line has become a bigger part of my identity than probably most other people's would be.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
In that sense.
Yeah.
So, that story to me kind of represents a lot, because it's a lot of my medical history and my medical issues that I'm dealing with right now I see as being directly related to that, through this like intergenerational passing on of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Right now I'm dealing with gestational diabetes, and it's really like, it's intense.
Yeah.
I'm part of this. Among the studies that I have read, and among the stories that I've heard from other pregnant women on how they experience gestational diabetes, it can be very mild, and it can be easily controlled with diet. But my situation is very not easily controlled with diet.
Oh,
and I'm on like a pretty substantial dose of insulin at night, and a pretty a decent dose during the daytime as well. And that's just like barely controlling my sugars right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm also controlling with diet and exercise, and basically I'm having to put a lot of effort into this, where other people might not have to.
Right.
And I think it's interesting too that my health issues kind of center around childbearing, because so do my mom's tend to be, and my grandma's tend to be. My grandma has type 2. My great grandma died of type 2.
Oh.
My mom has pre-diabetes, pre type 2, and I have gestational.
Yeah.
So there's this like diabetes that's been passed on and slowly seems to express itself not quite as seriously each generation. What's interesting is rice and beans happen to be pretty high glycemic index foods. And so if that was the basis of my grandma's diet, that may have some influence on the diabetes that they had.
That it could contribute to that?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, or even caused it. So. Yeah. So, and then my grandma has PCOS, I'm pretty sure, and she struggles with anxiety disorder. And my mom has had, similar issues with too much testosterone production, and just a number of different things that sort of seem to express themselves throughout that line in slowly, progressively better ways through time.
Yeah.
And so I, knowing a little bit about how intergenerational trauma works, I feel like kind of gives this some context too, because, and this kind of relates back to like me reading up from the Black Lives Matter movement. I've been reading this book by Resmaa Menakem, called My Grandmother's Hands. And he is a psychologist, I believe. I don't know if he's a psychiatrist, maybe. Um, but he's sort of like applied some of the newer science on intergenerational trauma to healing racial trauma, and both for Black bodies and white bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, basically, so the science that has that we've been done, that's been done on this topic, has kind of been born from trying to figure out why Black people have worse health outcomes than white people, and even other races. Generally, Hispanic people have worse outcomes than white people, but not quite as bad as Black people. And so these studies that have been done have been trying to figure out, like, why do Black women, for example, die in childbirth at 3 times the rate of white women? And why do Black babies die at almost 4 times the rate of white babies? And the answer is multifaceted. But part of the answer is lived experienced racism, so the oxidative stress and the allostatic load of literal physical, like lived experiences during a lifetime actually cause that oxidative stress to cause free radicals to go throughout the body. And actually, so like when your nervous system is activated, it kind of floods the body with this rush of hormones. You get like catecholamines and adrenaline and all kinds of stuff, and it takes at least like 24 hours to wash it all through. And so we talk about cortisol as the stress hormone, but that usually is just the one that hangs on the longest and can be tested for later. So so that's like a sign that the body's been flushed with all these hormones.
Yeah.
And this process of like having your system activated that way during a moment of trauma or a moment of extreme stress can have a lasting effect on the cells in your body. It can, cause free radicals to go about, and oxidative stress, and especially if it's chronic and consistent and happening a lot over time, it can damage your cells. And so in all different types of ways and places. And so Black people actually have higher risks of, long-term complications like heart disease. And it's essentially as if they are aging faster because they're at higher risk for all these different diseases that can result from this cell damage. And so intergenerational trauma kind of comes about when this oxidative stress gets written into our epigenetics, especially during the prenatal period. So what I eat and the stress that I experience in pregnancy is directly affecting my baby.
Right. Yeah.
Which sounds like a lot of pressure, but
yeah.
But that's kind of how that works, is that like the amount of sugar in my body is influencing how much my baby is influencing the insulin production of my baby's body as it's developing.
Right.
And so gestational diabetes puts her at risk of type 2 diabetes and obesity later on in life, at higher risk. And breastfeeding is something that I've made a priority because it can mitigate the risk of breast cancer for me, but also mitigate the risk of the development of type 2 diabetes for me later on in life. And it can help mitigate some of those risks for my baby. So it's just interesting to see how when oxidative stress happens in pregnancy, it can affect the epigenetics of a child in the womb. And during the prenatal period, that baby can be at higher risk for certain diseases based on the prenatal environment that they've been in, because it kind of teaches them like either the environment you're being born into is safe or it isn't.
Yeah.
And so one thing that comes along with oxidative stress as well is preterm birth. So, the baby might actually be ejected from the womb too early because the system is kind of telling it it's not safe here.
Oh.
So get out.
Yeah.
And that's a really simplified way of putting it. But,
but very, very visceral too. I mean, to think of starting off life that way.
Yeah, I think emotions really affect people's bodies, but never more so than in pregnancy. I mean, there have been studies on how the emotions of a person in labor can directly affect the outcomes of that labor. Mm-hmm. And that's where a lot of like the science regarding doulas comes from as well.
Yeah, I was going to say that must tie into your work, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this is kind of how I got introduced to it, actually, is, when I was looking into becoming a doula after my last birth, because it had been kind of traumatic. I'd had a planned home birth that I then transferred and then had a cesarean for chorioamnionitis, which happens to also be a complication of uncontrolled gestational diabetes. And so I was looking into being a doula and found that there were all these studies about how even just having a person in the room who is not associated with the hospital, they don't have to do anything. Just take notes.
Yeah.
But they did this. This was kind of one of the earlier on studies regarding doulas, was having a person, an individual study-related person, not affiliated with the hospital or the person's family, who sat in the corner and just witnessed the birth, actually increased good outcomes. So, things like, it was associated with things like lower cesarean rates and less use of medication for pain, less use of Pitocin, fewer NICU admissions, just all kinds of good outcomes for babies and mamas.
So is that an influence of that person's presence on the behavior of the staff?
Yeah, so the why behind it is kind of still debated, and we have yet to do more studies on it. I think we need to put more money into studying it, to be honest. But part of the reason we think is that, for one thing, being observed makes doctors act better.
That makes sense. Yeah,
that's one thing. But then also, there's this mysterious part of it where a woman being witnessed by someone who is compassionate towards her and is not responsible for her medical outcomes, who is not judging her in any way, who's not family or has a long history with her that might affect things, can have that sort of doula effect.
Yeah.
So
I was thinking with our 3 children, the last birth was definitely the best experience by far, because we did have somebody like that, who was somebody who my wife knew beforehand and had a trusting relationship with, and I'm sure she could tell you even better than I could, but I could tell, it was definitely just a much more positive experience overall.
Yeah. It seems like the better the relationship, the better the outcome.
Yeah. Now, did you say
it helps because, as a doula, I can get to know somebody without having to be so close to them that they, because with family it gets complicated. With family, there's judgment and history and all kinds of things. But you can, with a doula, you can get really close to them without without any of that.
Having all the baggage.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
And you can be friends, and you can have somebody to rely on and somebody to share information with you, but also physically be there for you. And like, it's literally their job to be there for you.
Yeah.
And I have a doula now myself, and it's awesome.
Great. Yeah.
She's been able to like come to my doctor's visits with me so that I can feel more confident negotiating birth plan issues with my doctor. And she's been able to teach my husband more tools on how to comfort me in labor and help him be an effective birth partner. And, just all kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, do you get into both on the receiving end and also as a doula? Do you get into the intergenerational stuff?
Yeah. So I probably don't. I mean, I don't really bring it up with my clients, and I don't. I guess maybe just my understanding of intergenerational trauma is just that it's something that can be written into our bodies from the history of our families. And it's something that you have to actively heal. And so in Resmaa Medicum's book, he gives these suggested, what he calls practices at the end of every chapter that you can use to, and they're personalized for your race or and stuff. So, but you can use them to they're sort of meditations, kind of, but they're things to do with your body in order to learn how to regulate your nervous system in situations that would normally trigger it.
Yeah.
And so it's I guess, because his book is centered around racial healing, a lot of the practices that he suggests are regarding situations that historically our ancestors may have dealt with. For example, having someone behind you. So one of the things that he suggests for people of color is, from the history of slavery and having a slave driver behind your back as you're picking cotton, having whipped those people in slavery. One of the body practices that he suggests, and frequently, is turning around to look behind you and to just remind your body and remind your amygdala that there's nobody there and that you're safe.
Yeah.
And so it sounds kind of mystical, but it's based in science, and so I kind of like the mixture of like mysticism in my science and science in my mysticism. And so,
and I do too. It's something that I've kind of changed on over time, but I saw holistic medicine in practice that was kind of I'm not sure what best to describe it. It was kind of a meditation relaxation treatment, and it was with my wife, and it was very effective. Was
it sort of more like body based or more like
the
head kind of thing?
It was both. It was both.
So like a little somatic, a little.
Yeah, I guess I would say I used to be more like skeptical of anything that wasn't came in the form of a pill or something, right?
Yeah.
But that was a very transformative experience for me to see how effective that could be, without even getting into any particular metaphysics behind it. Just that it was a very good experience and seemed to help. So that's significant, right?
Yeah, you don't need to know the science to know what it feels like.
Right, exactly.
because when you do it, you can tell whether or not your nervous system is calm or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can tell whether it's calming you or whether it's agitating or tensing up or restricting part of your body. And you can kind of, the more you do it, the more you can get to know the way that your body specifically responds to different stimuli.
Yeah.
Like if you say some sort of negative affirmation or you imagine being around somebody that you are fighting with, and you pay attention to what's happening in your body, you can sort of listen to, like, am I hunching at my shoulders? Are my hands getting sweaty? Am I, like, do I feel like there's a chill down my spine? Do I want to look away? Do I, just any of the urges that come to your body, you can kind of pay attention to. And then the next thing would be to switch that and think of a positive affirmation or a positive memory, or maybe being around someone that you love, that supports you, and paying attention to the ways that your body relaxes. Maybe your shoulders go down, maybe you take a deep exhale like I just did, or maybe you feel like your heart center opens up, or whatever you imagine is happening in your body. That kind of knowledge about your body can help you be able to tell where your nervous system is in relation to your external environment.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that body-centered approach seems very very significant and important.
Yeah.
Like, we focus a lot on ideas, and ideas are important too, but but we're also embodied.
It becomes especially important in pregnancy and birth, because
sure,
you're specifically, like, your emotions are directly affecting what's happening in your body. And whether or not this baby you're able to help this baby navigate through the ins and outs and the turns and twists of going through the pelvis, because that's kind of a process. The baby has to do, like, these twistings and these wrigglings in order to get around first the pubic bone, and then the ischial spines, and then the sacrum. And so it's kind of a process.
Yeah.
And so if there are emotional holdups, they can become body holdups, and those can express themselves in stalled labor, in any part of the process of the labor. There have actually been, and I've seen this happen before, where a woman is in labor and she's laboring just fine, and something either happens or she is dealing with something that she's not, like, dealing with.
You mean like in her life, or?
Yeah. So sometimes it's like just something she needs to say out loud, or something that she needs to finally pay attention to. Maybe she's been fighting with her partner and she's been ignoring that, or maybe she's just scared to be a mom and needs to say out loud, like, I'm scared to be a mom.
Yeah.
And something will happen, and so that those kinds of things can actually be, and I've heard from this happen with many midwives as well, is when something like that happens, it can have a physical expression of stalled labor. And sometimes if you figure out what that thing is, or you get her to explore it and it gets released, things go back to normal again.
Yeah.
And labor goes on progressing. And so, that becomes.
Yeah. It's fascinating, how complex human labor is.
Yeah.
And
They've even seen, I've heard stories of like during the pushing process where they'll do a cervical check and find, oh, she's, I don't know, 8 centimeters. And then something emotional happens. Like somebody comes in the room that's a stranger, or they start talking about cesarean and the mom's body tenses up, and then they do another cervical check and she's actually decreased in dilation. Maybe she's gone down to like 6 or 7 centimeters. Yeah, so the process of pushing and the process of dilation can both completely stop and even partially reverse.
wow.
If she's stimulated in a way, and it's, it's an evolutionarily protective measure that the body has built into it, that if, that was especially helpful in the wild, that
Sure.
if, you were giving birth and there was danger nearby and something presented itself to be dangerous, you didn't necessarily want to be giving birth right then. So
yeah.
it has a way of like stopping itself and not creating that expulsion of all that blood and placenta that can smell really good to predators. And
yeah, and it's interesting, like it's seems like one of those things that seems almost obvious in hindsight, but the idea that there would be I guess that we would continue bearing the effects of trauma from our ancestors, I mean, that makes perfect sense because we're the products of our ancestors, right? And you mentioned evolution. Of course, all of those possible traumas that could arise in order to survive and give rise to us eventually, those were responses to those.
We're teaching our babies through our bodies how to be safe.
Yeah.
And so and mainly the most effective way that the body has of doing that is by teaching our babies what's dangerous, what to be afraid of, and that's become less helpful in our more modern society just because the physical dangers are less physical.
Right.
And so we become more sensitive to the anxiety inducing imaginary fears, or not imaginary, but the more less physical fears. And so anyways, kind of bringing this back to like Jung and finding balance, is I see these body practices that Dr. Medicum suggests as being one way of healing this intergenerational trauma, to reteach the body that you are safe in the ways that your ancestors may not have been safe, and teaching both the amygdala and your system, your vagal nerves and your lymphatic system, that you are safe in these situations, and thereby reducing that oxidative stress.
Yeah.
And so for me, because my ancestors, my grandma was escaping a domestic violence situation, I'm practicing positive body practices every time I have positive physical interaction with my safe husband. And I'm practicing it every time I eat foods that balance my glycemic index, that balance my sugars, that are good glycemic index foods, because I'm teaching my body that it doesn't need to respond that it needs to, I guess, I'm teaching it how to balance itself.
Sure.
And thereby teaching the baby in my womb how to balance her own sugars. Because by taking the insulin that I'm taking, I'm, telling her that there is insulin, and her body is being created in a way that will reduce her risk of similar problems developing.
So it sounds like so you're paying attention to your past, right? Your ancestors, and seeing what traumas they have faced, and you're aware of them, right? So, and then you're able to respond to them in positive ways.
Right.
Is that a good way of putting it?
Yeah. I'm finding my own individual ways of healing my ancestral trauma.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So like the things that my ancestors dealt with that might have taught, the things that my great grandma that might have taught my great grandma what was unsafe, I'm unlearning that.
Yeah.
And things that my grandma might have taught my mother were unsafe in the womb, I'm unlearning that as well. And so on and so forth throughout the generations.
So, do you feel it's good and constructive to be aware of those things and that history?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's going to be specific for each person and their family history and their racial history and their, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. You got me thinking now. It's something I guess I've thought about, but not in such a direct way, but about my own family history, and you would know some of it. But on one side anyway, that just different issues and health issues that people have had to deal with, and how
like grandpa dying of cancer.
Sure, definitely. That's definitely one, right? So those are things to pay attention to and to figure out how to respond to. That's an excellent concept.
Or for example, grandma's grandma having been in a polygamist situation.
Sure. Yeah. Yep.
I'm sure that had a level of trauma.
Yeah. That's part of the history. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And things that may not necessarily be capital T traumas can also play a role in it too. It's just a matter of, because there's no objective yardstick for what trauma is. There's no, is an event traumatic enough to have an effect on a body? It just is whether or not it does.
Right.
So it's all in whether or not the body perceived it as trauma or not. And so, that's why it's helpful to get to know our ancestors and how their bodies perceived their life experiences. But when it gets, beyond our ability to actually get to know them or hear their stories,
right,
it's just a little bit of guesswork. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, and then what do you do in that case with the guesswork?
I think probably part of it could be prayer and getting more into the realm of spirituality and connecting with your ancestors in any way that you feel is appropriate for you.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
So Resma Menakem, one of his body practices is actually suggests inviting one of your ancestors into the room with you in meditation and feeling their energy and feeling whether or not they're there to be supportive or not, and getting to know them a little bit.
Oh, wow. That's powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I tried it, and honestly, it was a little scary.
Oh.
Just because I feel like sometimes the spirits that I was inviting were not always there to help me. But a couple of times there have been spirits who were there, who understood me and were there to bless my baby and there to support me. So
that's wonderful.
I'm getting to know them.
Yeah.
That way, because I can't necessarily get to know them in real life.
Yeah.
Or in person.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I love how there seems to be kind of this, development out of your academic studies right into just very personal.
Yeah.
Well, and spiritual and personal individuation, right? As you're talking about,
Yeah.
bringing it right home.
Exactly. And it also has to do with I think another tool that has been really useful for me besides these body practices has been EMDR that I'm doing in therapy with a therapist. I actually initially heard about EMDR and sought it out because other people who had home birth transfers suggested it for trauma.
Okay.
And so I'm virtually doing these sessions with a therapist where there's like these two green balls that go back and forth across the screen, and there's like a binaural sound in my headphones, and or maybe sometimes we'll like do a somatic sort of like back and forth. The point is getting two sides of stimulation to stimulate both sides of the brain, to strengthen the connection between the two sides.
Okay.
And as you are reprocessing trauma and memories that may be difficult, that are still stimulating to you. So where talk therapy, or like, Jungian therapy might be more cognitive and more talking about things and, thinking about things in new ways, having insights about yourself. This kind of therapy deals more with the hindbrain and the amygdala to especially because trauma has a way of like activating your nervous system, whether or not you want it to.
Sure.
Like anxiety, for example, that I and my mother and my grandmother have all struggled with, it's a totally different thing to understand that something is not scary versus being in a situation that's scary and having your body react to it.
Yeah.
You just don't have a whole lot of like control over it. It's not like you can tell yourself I'm safe and just automatically feel safe.
Sure. Yeah.
So EMDR is sort of a process of retraining your hindbrain to not be so sensitive to certain triggers or certain situations or memories of trauma, so that you can sort of reduce your sensitivity to that thing and reteach your brain that whatever that thing is, it's safe.
Yeah.
It's some other things I've kind of been able to do with it are identifying core beliefs that my brain might be having that I'm unaware of, which would be my shadow.
Yeah.
My shadow side of the feminine.
So that's the Jungian concept, right? The shadow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the like when I talk about the amygdala, I feel like that's the shadow is just it's another name for it, really.
Sure. Yeah.
Your fight or flight brain, the thing that your lizard brain, the thing that turns on to tell you whether something's scary or not. And so EMDR is another way of sort of accessing that lizard brain and reteaching it what's safe and what isn't.
Yeah.
And so.
Well, that sounds very comprehensive. Because because the brain's more than just one section. So.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I could see how that would be very helpful.
Yeah. So some things that I've been able to do in EMDR have been reprocessing particular moments within my birth experience with Arden, and re-examining them, or allowing my brain to, and like the cool thing about EMDR is it's really self-directed. Like my therapist is not telling me what to think. I'm just watching the green balls and I'm letting my brain do all the work. Like I'm letting it work itself out. And so I just go with the thought process wherever it's sort of like a meditation type thing. And I let my brain go with whatever it's going to go. I start with an idea, maybe a memory of a moment from my birth last time and why it was triggering for me and the feelings behind that. And maybe that leads me to recognizing a belief that I had that maybe led to that feeling. And then I can analyze that belief and decide whether it's true or not. And then maybe even replace it with something that's more helpful. For example, one that I personally have dealt with is I'm alone. And it's not something that like I cognitively believe, I do not literally believe that I'm alone.
Right.
But when I access memories of my birth trauma, there were moments where my body felt totally alone and felt abandoned.
Yeah.
And so my brain can kind of reprocess those moments and sort of re-examine them in ways that show me that I actually wasn't alone, or that being alone is not as scary as I think it is.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So just there's tons of ways that it goes. It's spreads out all kinds of different ways.
Yeah. Well, and that's fascinating that it's working really cool. At such a deep level too. I'm grabbing the back of my head. So that core belief that you're alone, it's something that you didn't choose, aren't actively cognitively reinforcing, but something that's
right. And it's not something that I'm gonna easily tell myself, well, I'm not alone. Like my cognitive brain can say, well, you're not alone, you're fine. But that's not going to make my body feel better. That's not going to make my nervous system actually calm down.
Yeah. It reminds me, I was having one time when we were at Zion, I was talking with your mom. I think you were there too. And because we were talking about different types of therapy, and she mentioned something about how LDS men especially like the very direct cognitive approaches. I don't know if it's maybe a culture of bullet points and this is how we're going to solve this issue and address it or something like that. But
it's definitely a cultural value. For sure.
Yeah. That's perhaps not an essential one to our theology, thing. But I can see how that goes deeper, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good point, is that cultural values kind of come from a place. I think they probably also come from this intergenerational phenomenon of what was important to our ancestors. The fact that white male culture generally values cognitive thinking has a lot to do with the history of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and, European history and the values that they had around cognitive thinking. So.
Oh, yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah. Hold on just a second. What you got? What you got, baby?
I want you to snuggle.
You want to snuggle? All right, we'll snuggle in a bit, okay? I don't want to give her any trauma, right? So.
Yeah. I think that's inevitable. I don't think you can stop yourself from
and that's an interesting thought too, right? Is I guess I'll mention. I don't think I've mentioned before. I actually have read Menachen's book on the My Grandmother's Hands, and something that struck me about it was I just feel a lot of love and compassion from the author.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, very much. And, but kind of, I get this idea that, the trauma's inevitable, but we're all doing the best we can.
And it's not just one side either. I think it's really interesting that he points out that European bodies, what white people did to black bodies it wasn't invented at chattel slavery. What European bodies did to each other was traumatic also. And definitely I think chattel slavery was sort of like this. I mean, Ibram Kendi would say that racism was sort of an invention to justify an economic means, or the personal, the selfish desires of people in power. But
Sure.
But also, it's a case of, you know, the abused becoming the abuser. You know, it's European people who were brutal to each other in all sorts of ways, and then went around and were brutal to everybody else too.
Yeah, right.
Because they, you know, they had indentured servitude of European people, and when that no longer became, and it, you know, serfdom, and when that no longer became a viable economic model, they had to look out to other sources for that. So
right, yeah,
became passed
that's
on
an interesting
trauma.
point. Yeah. So like Kendi's idea and Menachen's ideas, I mean, I guess they're not necessarily conflicting, but there's
they're different, but I sort of see them as both.
Yeah.
I think they're both valid explanations for why racism exists, and I think they were both at play. I think probably Menachen's idea of where racism comes from is a deeper, more amygdala focused explanation for the source of slavery and racism, versus Kendi's ideas are more how that expressed itself in economic models and history. So
right. Yeah, excellent.
They're both pretty cool.
Yes. Good. So did you have more points you wanted to go through?
I think, I mean, I feel like I covered like a lot of like the stuff that's been going on in my head, I guess.
If
one other part that I've been doing on my individuation process has been also looking at sexual identity.
That's actually what I was going to ask about. Yeah, if you wanted to get more into that, so perfect.
I mean, I probably don't have as much like scientific knowledge in this area, but more just education on that I've been educating myself on sexual identity since my little brother came out several years ago. And you know, he's married now, and they're super cute. But and then also the way that Jung sees gender fluidity as being part of identity development. I think the way that the church treats sexuality sort of, I think, is counterproductive to that development of sexual identity.
Okay, yeah.
So as far as like my own identity, I've dealt with same-sex attraction myself, and whether or not I want to identify as bisexual is just, it's not important, I guess.
Sure.
It's just a matter of whether or not I want to take on that identity, I guess.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've heard from other women in the church has been that, women are just more sexual, or that like, or that women are just generally more fluid with sexuality. And so that's just a normal thing. We all deal, like most of us deal with that. So it's not a thing.
Yeah.
But
now, is there truth to that?
I mean, technically, I think there is some science behind, and statistics behind how women are more commonly change their sexual identity throughout their lifetime.
Okay.
But I don't think thinking of it that way is particularly healthy.
Because that sounds like it's kind of dismissing it, right? Is that?
Yeah.
That's what you don't like of it.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think it's something that is, I think in terms of the church, it's a way of dismissing it and a way of saying, well, as long as you like guys, you should be going for the guys. You know? And so, yeah, I don't know.
I see.
Thought wasn't really fully formed, but
well, no, let's talk about it some more. Because that's very interesting. So, so if these are processes of individuation, I could see you're going to need some room, right?
Right.
Kind of
yeah. So
mentally go in those areas.
Yeah, exactly. So within the structure of the church, all sex is off the table until you're married.
Sure.
And that in itself is inherently like against this Jungian idea of being able to discover and express your sexuality before settling into an identity. And so specifically for Jung, a straight identity, but for anyone, an identity. And I think probably the Mormon culture stunts that in a way. One thing that my little brother said about growing up in the church was that he always felt like he had to hide something. And I just found that really, I never knew this until recently. And this was kind of blew my mind, but he always felt like he had to hide something even in primary lessons, but that he had no idea what it was. He didn't know what it was that he was hiding, but he always felt like he'd done something wrong and he had to hide it. And so, I mean, I think it probably just comes from also, you know, the church teaching family values about going to the temple and being sealed for eternity. And, you know, even the primary church song of like, I love to see the temple.
Right. Yeah.
Can be a different experience for a child who is gay and doesn't know it yet.
Yeah.
And so for Dallin, that was really kind of traumatizing, and affected, you know, his development and contributed to the issues that he had later on.
Right.
And I think in a way it probably affects all of us, because we're not given that freedom to explore our own individuality and our own individuation.
Or even in just thought, right? Because there's the idea of having pure thoughts, which isn't really well defined, but I could see how that constrains the range of thoughts that we're able to, or emotion, not just thoughts, right? Emotions, impulses that we process through, because those are kind of seen as, those are bad, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then it's, and the fact that there are so many women in the church who get married and then have issues with sex with their partners, like that is very telling.
Sure. Yeah.
I met so many women at BYU who were having this issue, and were so confused at why now it's okay to have sex. How come I'm having trouble doing it?
Yeah.
You know, and it's because they haven't even been given the space to explore their own sexuality individually as people before being married, before having to share that with someone else already, you know? So.
Yeah, I wanted to get into that as well, because that's one of the, so does Jung talks about that a lot? The kind of sexual development?
I mean, I don't think that Jung talks about it explicitly, but it is something that we covered in my BYU class.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Just because we were talking about Jung in context of gender issues. And at the time when I was taking this class, this was like when the ordained women movement was sort of, and there were like protests happening at General Conference. And so we were sort of discussing like, so what are women's roles in the church?
Oh, sure.
And are women oppressed in the church? And why are women so upset about this not having the priesthood thing? And I had never even like dealt with those issues before then.
Sure.
But I think the general like church consensus among women, or at least the justifications that many of them kind of came to, were that they either settled on either a misogynistic view of, well, I don't want the priesthood because that's just more responsibility and I don't really want to handle that responsibility. I don't see that as helpful or empowering to women. Or they would say, well, women already have the priesthood in other ways. And they would say, well, in the temple, women have the priesthood. And yet, I don't know if you know, have you read, I forget what it's called. I always want to call it Women and the Priesthood, but I think it's actually called The Priesthood Power of Women by Barbara. Anyway, it's one that I have read a couple times recently because I feel like it just, for me, it outlined church doctrine really clearly where I didn't understand things before. So I read The Power of, or what is it called? It's called Women and Priesthood Power, or the Power of Women. I don't remember what it's called. It's by Barbara Morgan Gardner. I remember her name.
Oh, okay.
And basically for me, it just sort of outlined like exactly what the church doctrine is regarding women in the church. And essentially there are two priesthoods, one being the patriarchal order and the other being the familial order. And the patriarchal one being the hierarchical structure of the church itself, and the other being the familial, the priesthood that women have access to through the temple. And that one specifically actually being a lot more egalitarian when it comes to priesthood power between men and women. And at one point in the book, she sort of, suggests that the patriarchal order eventually will fall away when the millennium comes. That it's, the structure of the church is not necessarily eternal.
Oh, okay.
But that the ordinances in the temple are what's eternal. Okay, and that is the priesthood that will continue on into the eternities. And so when women say that they have access to the power of the priesthood in the temple, I still think like some church politics are at play there.
Sure.
It's only recently that women have started to be able to witness baptisms.
Right.
And women can't perform sealings, or there are a few certain things that they can't do in the temple. Most of the things they can, and there are still some sort of structurally misogynistic things that are woven throughout temple ordinances, in my opinion.
Yeah.
The fact that things do change and that they are changing sort of leaves this openness for like, well, how much of this is the church or
right.
how much of this is, old white cis men leading the church, and creating and interpreting revelation for the church versus actual revelation from God.
Yeah.
You know, how much of what happens in the temple is actually God, and how much of it is old white cis men.
Yeah. Well,
interpreting him for us.
right. Yeah.
You know,
Seems like an important theological question to ask all the time, right? How much of this is,
and
am I reading into this? Yeah.
Yeah, it's something that I think every woman and every LGBTQ person struggles with or will struggle with to some extent, and honestly, I think it requires quite a bit of like mental gymnastics for people to you know, reconcile their faith with the structure of the church in ways that white males don't have to.
Yeah. Right.
So,
yeah. That it might not occur to cis white males. Yeah, I can see that.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, this is the same with the history of the church and Black people. Is there are definitely very clearly things in our church history that are racist.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, even down to like, well, obviously a lot of the things that Brigham Young said were pretty clearly racist, and then
right.
You know, just the fact that we worship a white Jesus alone is a historical invention, and just a bunch of different things.
Yeah, well, and those are
the way that we worship in sacrament, where we're required to sit down in pews and take the sacrament quietly, is sort of culturally specific and exclusive in a way. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, it makes me think of how we were talking earlier about how being aware of our history and our genealogical history and all the stuff that comes with it helps to address things in a better way, you know?
Yeah, definitely. So, like, if you don't come to terms with the history of the church, you can be perpetuating that trauma. You know, because people who don't critically examine the history of the church, and who don't not even just the history, but like the current structure of the church,
right,
are perpetually just reinforcing those same cultural ideas and further perpetuating more harm and more more trauma, essentially. And it's why we have such a small membership of Black people in the church, and LGBTQ people who stay in the church.
It makes it hard.
Yeah.
To say the least,
yeah.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's a challenge, but
I'm
seems
always like somewhere in the middle. I don't think I've ever really settled any of these questions for myself.
Right. And is that I guess what do I want to say? Is that upsetting to not have them settled, or?
I mean, it can be, definitely sometimes.
Naturally, would be, right? Yeah. It's like,
yeah. But I think most of the time, I have to recognize that, like, it's not a dichotomy of being in the church or out of it, and it doesn't have to be.
Right.
You know, it's going back to Jungian balancing of opposites. I think you can get too polarized where you hate the church for all the bad things that they teach, and you can also just cling on to whatever ideology they feed you for you to justify it.
Sure.
But those are both extremes that, you know, that are unhealthy. And so you kind of have to just find a balance somewhere.
Yeah.
Where you can reckon with history and harm and social and like dealing with other people.
Uh-huh.
And how they might be hurt by the church and yourself, and how the church might be hurting you, versus still having access to your spirituality and still having access to the good things that a church might provide, like community and a sense of purpose, and however the church supports your own individuation.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, I wasn't even thinking to get into that, but that really does relate to a lot of what I talk about on the podcast generally, and I love the bringing the individuation into it. That's fantastic, because I know a lot of the people I talk with or who listen have similar type of thoughts and concerns, and I just think these are. These type of stuff, these type of things we've been talking about are just very, very helpful in those ways.
I feel like when I bring them up with people, they either get really defensive or
right.
or they start to describe this shelf that they have.
Uh-huh.
And this is so common. I feel like maybe this is an archetype or something, but like
the metaphor of the shelf.
Yeah,
I think I've heard
has
it
this
too.
Metaphor of the shelf, where they have this shelf where they take parts of the church or the history of the church or their issues or whatever it is, and they put it on the shelf for now.
Right.
The problem is, if you don't take things off that shelf ever, they're gonna fall off the shelf sometime.
Yeah.
And you kind of have to find this balance between being able to put things on the shelf and regularly taking them down to examine them and putting them back up again. Because if you're not doing that, they're going to get really heavy and they're going to break the shelf.
I'm trying to remember, didn't Mencken have some concept of like doing things slow and easy, or like hard and all at once?
Yes.
There's something like that.
Exactly. Yeah, because your nervous system doesn't learn things all at once. It the whole reason the intergenerational trauma affects our bodies for so long is because it's small instances over a long period of time.
Yeah.
So like my body is the expression of every small instance of trauma that my mother, that my grandmother, that my great-grandmother, and so on have all experienced throughout the entire span of their lives. Mm-hmm. So if I am to slowly unravel that, I can't do it all at once because one, it's a lot of work to do, but also like my nervous system can't handle that.
Right.
That's a lot of stimulation for one nervous system to handle everybody else's nervous systems.
Yeah.
Throughout history. So, same with ideas in the church is that like, it helps to not overload your nervous system with the ideas that might challenge it or activate it. But it will help to be able to do it in small amounts over
little bits at a time. Yeah. It seems more self-compassion.
That way you can build up resilience, which is another major idea from Mencken.
Right. Yeah.
Resilience and just your ability to adapt and your ability to handle things grows and grows with each of those encounters.
Right.
So
wonderful. Well, good. Any other thoughts you wanted to go over?
I think that's generally kind of what was on my mind.
Awesome. Well, I would love to have you back for more.
I just love Mencken because the idea of looking at race issues through a trauma lens has been so helpful. It explains a lot of things about like why it's so easy to commit microaggressions without knowing, and why white people are going around hurting Black people and thinking they're not hurting Black people.
Uh-huh. Right.
And why, for example, every death of a Black person that is sanctioned by the state is a traumatic event, whether or not a white person might look at it and see it as a race issue.
Oh, yeah.
Because white people, their favorite thing to do when something like that happens is to say, oh, well, that guy's shooting was justified because of this specific situation, and
X, Y, and Z, and
it had nothing to do with race. It was just the police officer doing their job. But the reality is that, like, it triggers this collective unconscious traumatic response from a long history of abuse, and it doesn't matter whether, like, the details of that situation were race specific or not. What matters is whether that trauma response happens or not.
Right.
So
yeah, seems like a message that would be very helpful to spread wide and take on. Definitely goes deep.
Yeah, I think it would help a lot of white people to see why that happens, and also to just have more compassion for it.
Right.
Because I think that's the real thing, is that there's like this lack of compassion happening, and it's
right. Yeah.
Not good.
Yeah.
For anybody. It just perpetuates harm. So.
Right. Yeah. And compassion is definitely what I sense from Mencken in great amounts.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today.